In the last part, we discussed the relative scale of our two conflicting empires. I'd like to now build on what was established going forward to part 2. Manpower will always be an essential factor to consider in any interstellar war, whether it be for uses in trade, ground battles, naval operations, and other actions. Estimating the civilian and military population of both of these factions will be an essential component to this video and help determine who will come out on top in the end. We will start with population, as this will necessarily inform the military troop count in the second part. So where do we begin? The only broad declarative statement we have seen on the matter, that I have seen, is a quote I have previously listed. Powerful, unified empire stretching across hundreds of worlds and billions of individuals. Billions of individuals and hundreds of worlds. Were a quote that only applied in the time of Halo 3, it might be accurate, if we go with my earlier assumptions about the Legolo and their true connection to the Covenant, or lack thereof. But let's have a look at the confirmed population numbers we have. With respect to the Covenant, we have some interesting numbers to mess with. Balahol, 320 million. Iane, 978 million, plus the rest of the Udeo system, 2.9 billion. Doisak, 12.5 billion. Glyke, billions. Hezduros, 1.9 billion. High Charity, 7.7 billion. Malurok, 2.1 billion. Palamok, trillions, over 2,000 years ago. Sanghelios, 3.9 billion to 8.135 billion. T, 1.98 trillion. To the best of my knowledge, this is the total of the Covenant populated worlds we are aware of. Just adding up what we have in concrete numbers gives us over 35 billion people without adding in Glyke, or the Legolo and Yanmei, or the hundreds or thousands of nameless worlds we know exist. We have Balahol, homeworld of the Grunts, stated in several sources to be depopulated. A backwater, yet it still boasts over 300 million grunts. The home system of the Kigyar, with just shy of 3 billion individuals total, is split up across a homeworld of 900 million jackals and a potential of around 300 million on any of up to 5 colony worlds in system, or more. The brutes number over 12 million on their homeworld, which will represent the overwhelming majority of their people, but its 2 colonial moons of Warial and Tish may potentially have as many as 1 billion on each at a push, but brutes don't really strike me as the sorts prone to huge population surges.
Brutes! The faster you can kill those brutes, the better. They don't have shield generators, but take them out before... It's berserking!
The Sangheli frontier world of Hezduros is described in Halo Warfleet as a remote colony, and according to the latest encyclopedia, an older one, as it's stated to predate the Covenant. Alongside it, we have the elite homeworld of Sanghelios, which had 8 billion people before the end of the war, according to the Beastarium. The Warfleet seems to have either contradicted that number, or vanished half of the population since the end of the war. And Malurok, a remote colony world that the Covenant frequently forget even exists, but is one of the earliest Covenant colonies, which boasts 1.9 billion people. Glyke, similarly, is one of the most premier worlds in the whole Covenant, being the site of the most important of shipyards in the Empire. It too predates the founding, with an account of some billions of people living on the world before it was destroyed. All in all, most of the worlds we know all seem to have billions of people, but I will note that they are either homeworlds of races, or are potentially up to over 3,000 years old. So where do we go from here? We have a few options. As with the last video, there's a scale we're going to employ. We're going to take our planet count from last week, and apply an average population figure to that number. So, we have our scale for planets. What do we use for people? On the lower end of the scale, we have Balahol, the washed out, resource exhausted Ungoi homeworld, 310 million, despite all details concerning the critical, near lifeless state it is in. Were we to apply this number across the entirety of the Covenant as the average population figure, the total Covenant civilian number would be between 320 billion to 8 trillion. divided amongst all races. Recall my previous reservations on using the higher end number for the planet figure, but it is there for your consideration. As for the highest of ends, well beyond the realm of what is reasonable, we can apply a number from one of these ancient pre-Covenant colonies in the modern era. If we take Gleick's number of billions as being just 2 billion, we have an absolute maximalist and frankly ridiculous take on Covenant space, having some 2 to 50 trillion people across 1,000 to 25,000 worlds. Now that's an all-encompassing calculation. For many it would be enough for the Covenant side, and we could move on to the Sith, but it's worth even a small look at whether that number lines up with what is sensible.
The Covenant are not an equal society by any metric, not on their political standing, not on their intellect, or by their population, so let's talk a little on that. The simplest and easiest way to gauge the initial military values of the Covenant at any given time is to look at the armed forces as they're presented by Halo fleet battles.
Despite the sheer immensity of its size and its seeming uniformity, the Covenant actually lacked a standing military. Instead, it possessed an extensive variety of martial organizations, under the control or influence of one or more of the ministries. These semi-autonomous military bodies, each containing many thousands of warriors and dozens of warships, were often unfriendly rivals at best, but they followed the executory decisions of the High Prophets and the High Council with unquestioning obedience. Though the Covenant military seemed a force of overwhelming unanimity to their adversaries, within it were viciously fought competitions for honor. While their fleets had the capacity to bring ruin to entire star systems, this only disguised the internecine conflict under the surface. An underlying mutual disdain and distrust eventually became a significant strategic advantage for humanity during the war.
We know from Broken Circle that there's hundreds of ministries who fight and overlap on resource allocation, meaning the Covenant military is some order of millions of people based on this source. But with a society of billions of individuals, we can surely go much deeper than this. Referring back to my investigations on Sangheili world count, I generously granted the elites 2,500 worlds of their own, or more, within the Covenant share. The most reasonable number of all, I would strongly argue, is about 800. Assuming every world matched Balaho's population, or had a far higher than average population of 2 billion, would give us anything from 256 billion to about 5 trillion elites across the whole of their society. From serfs to clerics, to warriors, children and the elderly, I personally wouldn't go beyond 500 billion in total, but I'm willing to entertain this value for the sake of the topic, and to extend an olive branch to individuals in the fandom who may have more of an affinity towards higher inflated numbers. There are inherent problems when using the bigger population figures for Covenant races across the board. A major component of this series, and one I would like to hammer home over time, is that the Human Covenant War was not even remotely close to the cakewalk or festival of slaughter that you have probably been led to believe, whether by the new revisionist lore or slogans thrown around by fans, either willfully dishonest or simply uninformed. I would reiterate that the existence of so many elites and other races creates some rather glaring questions regarding the Human Covenant War and the schism that followed. We actually know that the war against humanity hit even remote Sangheili worlds quite hard, with even the Kaidons of such worlds sacrificing their own sons to the fire of war.
I would speak with your father. Ask the Kaidon all he knows about the attack so I can punish those responsible. You can speak to the Kaidon, the Scion said, but not to my father. I don't understand. The Kaidon rides behind you. Had the half-jaw been less fatigued, his mind less focused on maintaining the outward appearance of calm authority, he would have immediately understood. But it took him a few more steps, crunching through the snow to work out the answer. One of the corpses on the sledge? No. The Kaidon is her brother, which was at first difficult to believe. Kaidons were mature masters of their keeps, rulers of entire provinces. The youth on the sledge was less than a decade old. Pale protective scales still hung from his neck, an evolutionary holdover from the days when Sangheili parents used to carry their offspring in their toothy jaws to keep them safe from predators as they hunted and gathered across Sanghelios's coastal plains. Most of my brothers died in the war, Tuul Jurong continued. Ranello, like most Sangheili colony worlds, had seen heavy recruitment during the Covenant's long fight against humanity. The two who remained joined my father in his final charge against the Jiralhanai. That was 3 days ago. We haven't seen any of them since.
Ranello, a remote colony on the edges of the Empire, was so stricken by losses during the war that the nobility themselves saw their numbers severely diminished. Note it is the narration, not Tul Duran herself, that notes that most Sangheili worlds saw heavy recruitment in the war against humanity. I want to make sure that you understand that this quote is not referring to the schism or post-war conflict at all, just a long war against humanity. Why is this relevant? Because we have at least one source on the human losses during the course of the Human Covenant War, and that number was 23 billion.
Back down the tunnel. "Where the hell's the rest of my squad?" demanded Corporal Palmer as she stepped forward. "The Wraith?" "Affirmative," John replied flatly. "They were killed in action." "Then we gotta go back." "We're going forward." "No, we're not," Palmer's brow furrowed. "We are not just going to leave them lying back there in this goddamn sewer." Cortana spoke to the entire group over their helmet-integrated comm units. "They will be left behind, just as the other 23 billion that preceded them were left behind, because they could not be saved, and carrying them with us will only make us vulnerable." They looked at John like he was a monster.
Not Navy losses, not Army losses, not fighting age men or women losses, no. 23.8 billion total losses across 27 years of war. Geriatric elderly, children, and the disabled, and other non-combatants. The overwhelming majority of this number will be the countless defenseless citizenry of the UNSC, butchered on the ground by armed soldiers, or glassed from orbit by machines of war, unable to actually fight for themselves. The consequences of this is if we accept the ultra-high Sangheili population and troop counts, the Sangheili alone, who in many instances are supposedly physically comparable to Spartans, are actually facing UNSC Marines in space or on the ground, often without Spartans to back them up, with numbers on the elite side, and are still dying at greater rates than they should be for all the physical robustness of the elites, lifetimes of training and superior tech. By the end of the war, their worlds were devastated by population losses inflicted by humanity, all the while losing a fraction of the population centers the humans did. Not exactly the one-sided slaughter one would believe if informed by internet forums. With high-end assumptions of population, and even most of the lower ones, the elites alone should have more soldiers than humanity has people in total. Back to the video. Generally, when I am looking at fictional populations and their potential contributions to manpower and warfare, I tend to base my assumptions on that of the United Kingdom's military percentage of the civilian population during the Second World War. The most common figure I've seen says that it was able to supply around 7.5% of its population to the war and still maintain its own society to a diminished extent. When you're dealing with authoritarian religious fanatics with their own private slave races, I'd imagine this number would be far higher. Considering the fact that the elites lost so many people as to have remote colonies feel the blow of population collapse, I think 7.5 is probably a comfortable minimum for them. So if we're going with the assumption of there being anything from 225 billion to 5 trillion elites, we can extrapolate that the Covenant can pull around 375 billion elites to fight in its wars, or if we go with my own lower and more reasonable assumption, 19.2 billion. The logical issues with either number is that this would mean the elites, who like the rest of the Covenant were brought to ruin in their war with humanity, had almost as many or more soldiers than the UNSC lost people across 27 years of war. Not soldiers and sailors, but massacred civilians on the ground. This in of itself would mean that the average UNSC soldier was killing multiple elites for every UNSC Marine that died. And once upon a time it was well established, for example, that in space battles the UNSC was sacrificing more ships to the Covenant than it was killing in straight combat situations. But alas, we shall be utilizing what some might consider to be a fair interpretation of the Covenant, but what I consider to be exceedingly inflated. For the Let Golo and drones, the revelation of having trillions of members in their respective races over 1,000 years ago has startling implications for the modern era. The problem, assuming any greater number than this, without even going into the issues with trillions of elites, is the fact that, like I went into in my last video, the Let Golo and drones are decidedly isolationist and seem to be generally unconcerned with widespread colonization. While we know of at least one colony with significant extrasolar populations for the Yanmi, we also know the elites seem to have founded it, and the population is only in the low billions. Considering it's existed for upwards of 3,000 years, I don't think that the drones are quite as aggressive with their population growth, or that their growth is strictly prohibited and managed by the prophets. This would make perfect sense, as the Ungoi have been severely curtailed and deliberately managed population-wise, and this notion of trillions of Yanmi is a new Halo lore addition in the last 3 years, so any number I throw out I feel will be arbitrary. There's really not much to go on. Trillions in the realm of 2 to 10 trillion seems like the extent of what you can reasonably argue, which I'm also going to say includes any colonies they might have. However, when it comes to arguing what their military shares should be, you could argue a society made up of disposable, uncreative drones would be far more willing to sacrifice supercarrier loads of drone soldiers on the front lines, but this would be an issue the prophets would need to work on and communicate to a population that in newer sources are stated to be rather apathetic to the Covenant. Not only that, they'd need to be able to move, feed, and equip every single soldier with weapons and anti-gravity harnesses in order for them to fly, as it's an established fact that drones cannot actually fly without them. For the Legolo, we will be going with the Halo 3 Boosterium and 2011 encyclopedia figure of 1.98 trillion. This is, as I have established, not the full story. Not only are most Legolo more or less not really members of the Covenant, but they are also not even able to form complex Megalicolo hunter forms. But a single hunter colony is made up of anything from dozens to hundreds of worms. By extrapolating the average mass of the worm to the mass of the hunter itself, we could work out a more accurate maximum figure for their actual contributions to the war, not including the more complex colony types the Legolo can make. The Halo Waypoint article on Legolo and Megalicolo gives us a span of mass for the average worm and the average Legolo. For the worms, we have 5.6 to 30 kilograms, and for the fully formed being, we have 4,536 kilograms to 4,990 kilograms from the Waypoint article.
Individual Lekgolo eels can vary dramatically in length, girth, and weight. Although the Covenant uses individual Lekgolo eels for a number of purposes, the most commonly encountered colony form is that of Megalekgolo, hunters. A single Megalekgolo colony is generally comprised of 2 Gestalt beings, each weighing several thousand kilograms and designed to engage in a form of physical combat, closely approximated to hunter-killer formations, hence their name. The Covenant further augmented this colony type by heavily arming and armoring the creatures to be even more formidable in combat.
This article seems to suggest that the colonies themselves weigh as much as thousands of kilograms, not including the armor and weaponry they're equipped with. If this is the case, we can hazard a guess at how many worms make up a single hunter. We know from Halo Ghost of Onyx that the generic hunter shield weighs 2 tons, so unless this has been retconned, if we assume the worms themselves weigh 2,000 kilograms, that gives us a remaining mass of about 500 to 900 kilograms, for the weapons and armor not including the shield. So, assuming each worm is about 5.6 to 30 kilograms, each hunter is comprised of around 375 to 66 worms. If we project that onto the home region of T's population of 1.98 trillion, and say, with exceeding and utmost generosity, that half the population are capable of and willing to establish hunter colonies, the maximum Megalicolo population could be anything from 15 to 5.28 billion. Most sources I have seen say that hunter colonies are composed of dozens of eels, so the upper figure may be the reasonable one, even if the numbers are hugely inflated. Thus far we have trillions of elites and drones, billions of hunters not factoring scarabs, how many Ungoi, how many jackals and brutes. For the brutes I'm not going to spend much time on the topic. We have 12 million brutes on Doisak, and this will be, unless I see better evidence, the upper majority for their race. With 12 billion present, this gives us just shy of 1 billion military brutes for war. We could assume its 2 moons have an additional population number between them to make the full number add up to 15 billion, with a military population of 1.1 billion. As a newly converted race of fanatics eager to prove themselves in the eyes of the prophets and the elites, as well as their innate propensity for aggression, this number of 7.5% is wildly underselling the potential for conscripts. As for those 100 colonies I mentioned in the last video, roughly 100 or so are unlikely to number more than a few million each. I would doubt that any would be anywhere near 100 million, even if we assumed that all they did in the last 30 years before the Human Covenant War was grow their population. The brutes seem to have been deployed to their worlds less as colonizing populations and more as asset denial. Across 100 planets, you may have as many as 1 billion, but I would categorically refuse to entertain any notion of significantly higher populations than this until we get insight into the brute's biology that declares that they are particularly fast at reproducing. 100 million to 1 billion heavy shock trooper brutes makes sense. given their role on the battlefield and in the Covenant. They appear to be their own limiting factor for population growth, much like the Krogan in Mass Effect, both having previously nearly rendered their world uninhabitable. The Jackals and the Grunts I will address together. These two are, in spite of everything said about the population numbers given by Bungie or calculated by myself, the absolute most common foot soldiers in the Covenant military. With a long retcon Nyland era novels showing that the Grunts outnumber the rest when deployed by orders of magnitudes in any battle they're shown in. So I'm going to take my minimum population on worlds we know for both and apply that to the planet figure I gave them from the last video. It's a conundrum for sure, because I sincerely don't buy the Jackals have much of any colonial holdings beyond the Udeo system. I feel the best you can seriously argue with the Jackals is hundreds of millions of soldiers, though I would imagine a large share of High Charity's population is split between both the Grunts and the Jackals, but we don't know for certain. With 320 million Grunts on Balaho being a lower-end population sample, and the average colony world in the home system having 300 million Jackals, both races can likely expect at a maximum end to supply about 180 to 192 billion citizens, with a military conscription of 13 to 14 billion soldiers. This population feels relatively reasonable to me on the higher end, but not for the Jackals, who I would argue only number as a race in the low billions. But for the Grunts, who in the era of Cortana's created were able to return to Balaho by the billions and supply that many soldiers for Covenant wars throughout history. We also know from Contact Harvest that at the war's beginning, Truth, in his ministerial role, was concerned that the Grunts were beginning to overpopulate High Charity again. We could grant the Grunts 1,000 Balahos, and they would come to 320 billion total across their slave colonies, which flies in the face of what we know about the Grunts as told by the Cold Protocol novel, and the sources on the Grunt Rebellion, which all say the Grunts would have faced extinction if killed on Balaho just 60 years before the war began. I would strongly argue that the newer lore of the Yanmi having trillions of drones is a truly bizarre addition, and causes issues when trying to reconcile the tales of Grunt overpopulation and micromanagement, because well after this section was written and nearly forgotten about by me, I found a very interesting source in the Halo Reach Premier Guide that I've never seen anyone else mention, which states that the Grunts are the most numerous of all the Covenant races. Again, huge logistical and logical issues arrive if we accept the Grunts as having more people than even the Yanmi, as retconned by newer sources. With 2 to 10 trillion Grunts spread across the Covenant, you're looking at a minimum of 2 to 10 billion Grunts per world on the more reasonable end of the spectrum, exceeding or matching the population of almost every known Covenant world except Doisak. This is all made all more of a headache to reconcile when you know that the Yanmi had trillions of drones over 2,000 years ago. Realistically, their population should be way higher if they have significantly colonized, which doesn't seem to line up with all the available evidence. You will recall that by the time of the Cold Protocol novel, in the midst of the Human Covenant War, they do not live in a methane-based atmosphere on any world. Who is making sure trillions of Grunts are capable of breathing? And moving or feeding that many Grunts is going to necessitate a tremendous amount of ships and resources. To summarize their populations and potential militaries for the sake of this video, they are as follows. Option 1, a broad brush approach. Covenant species is about 320 billion to 8 trillion people, divided amongst all races. On the hyper ridiculous end, 2 to 50 trillion, divided amongst all races. If we try to get a little bit more specific, the elites have 256 billion to 5 billion citizens, with a potential of 19.2 to 375 billion soldiers. The drones have 2 to 10 trillion with 150 to 750 billion plus, but realistically it's much higher. The Yanmi queens will say jump and the worker drones will ask how high. Brutes have about 16 billion people with 1 to 1.2 billion soldiers on the lower end. I would personally argue this potential is much higher. The Grunts have a potential population range from single digit billions to potentially hundreds of billions, and that same range of potential soldiers. But as I have said before, there are issues with this higher end of thinking. The Jackals realistically have hundreds of millions to single digit billions of soldiers at most. 180 billion civilians based on our numbers for the sake of this video, 13.5 billion soldiers at most. The Hunters have 1.98 trillion worms. The maximum amount of Hunter colonies that they could provide would be anything from 5.28 to 15 billion. We can also assume that the Shar Quarry of the Covenant Fringe will be able to supply at the very least hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of soldiers themselves, if they're ever deployed in the war. We know a single Shar Quarry colony in the post-war era, as shown in Halo Envoy, was capable of possessing hundreds of thousands of those ward beasts, to say nothing on the issues concerning their deployment to begin with. There are massive logistical challenges with actually mustering this Covenant full force, which shall be addressed later on down the line, but for now, this will suffice. Now, we move on to the Sith. The Sith, encompassing as many worlds as they do, naturally, will have a vast and expansive population pool to draw from. It should be noted that during the era of the Rakata per KOTOR 1, the Rakatan Empire at its height encompassed over 1 trillion slaves across 500 worlds. This number did not originally include the human population at the time of KOTOR's release.
I think the droid is trying to communicate with us by cycling through a variety of languages. Each time it spoke, it was using a very different alien dialect. The droid can probably understand us. The only problem is it may not have been programmed with the phonemes of a language we can understand. I recognize this language as well. It's an archaic variant of the Selkath dialect spoken on Manaan. But why would a droid on Dantooine be programmed to speak ancient Selkath?
But it has since been retconned that humans were also slaves. With Coruscant itself being an ecumenopolis for over 50,000 years before the Empire's collapse, this number is completely outdated. Even without Coruscant, this just here, among a fraction of the millions of homeworlds that would exist across the galaxy at the exact same time, that your average slave world pre-hyperdrive in the Infinite Empire has to have more than 2 billion slaves each, if it were distributed equally. And the conditions set upon these populations are not exactly conducive to promoting population growth. That trillion population figure by itself, carried across 20,000 years of colonization and population growth, would be countless orders of magnitudes higher than during the times of slavery, especially when the Republic reached over 100 million populated systems before 17,000 BBY. 13,000 years later, with access to technology vastly superior to our own, an assumption of 2 billion people on average per world is an easy minimum. We have supporting evidence in the form of West End Games, which has a stated average value for pre-hyperdrive industrial systems that haven't even split the atom yet as being around 4 or 5 billion people. Such a number would mean that the Republic was already in the hundreds of quadrillions by 17,000 BBY. In reality, much higher, with millennia of colonization to come. If we applied these lower figures to the Sith Empire's lower end calculations, they could expect anything from 18 to 22.5 quadrillion people, and a military manpower potential of 1.3 to 1.6 quadrillion soldiers. Those very Rakatan slaves would, in many or most instances, account for some of the populations that would join the first worlds of the Republic. I would argue these numbers are outdated by the suggestion in the Essential Atlas that Coruscant is some sort of client state of the Rakata, given that it's been a planet-wide ecumenopolis for such a long period of time, but we will stick with the average numbers as they were. On the notion of population, I'd like to take a moment and talk about ecumenopoli. For those of you who don't know, an ecumenopolis is a planet-wide city. In our world, a futuristic hypothetical. In Star Wars, quite a real sensation. And there's a few of them. You know some of the names. Nar Shaddaa, Coruscant, Taris. The problem with Star Wars, as in most fiction, is that the stated values for the ecumenopoli, among other stated values, is woefully underestimating the actual implications of things as they are. You will have no doubt heard the expression that sci-fi authors have no sense of scale countless times in your travels, and it's absolutely true. Ecumenopoli are not only planet-wide cities, but densely packed planet-wide cities. To make matters worse, the planet-wide city goes up and down by the kilometers, and in some cases goes below the planet's surface. There are so many people on Coruscant that even among other ecumenopoli, it stands alone. In the modern era, it is more populated than the next 10 systems combined in a galaxy of ecumenopoli. Its traffic has to be strictly controlled and enforced even in orbit, despite having garbage dispensers that vaporize trash on every street corner, or genetically modified species which exist just to eat refuse. Every hour, Coruscant produces 1 trillion tons of trash. Let me state that again. Every hour of every day, Coruscant produces 1 trillion tons of refuse that they have to get rid of, sometimes by throwing the excess into orbit, just to keep on top of things. That's 3,000 times the waste of the United States in a year, but they do it every hour. And yet, if you believe the stated population figures of 1 trillion or so, Coruscant supposedly has a population density that is less than half of Washington, D.C. This simply cannot be the case. Taris, in the KOTOR era, is no different. It's actually worse. Its stated population in the KOTOR Prima Guide is 6 billion, less than the population of our own world at this very moment, yet it's a planet-wide city. Taris, despite having an upper, middle, lower, and undercity, and being so populated they literally ran out of jail cells, is apparently less densely populated than Russia or even Finland.
The great city of Taris covers the entire surface of this planet. There is no land to grow food. Kelp harvests and the creatures of the sea are our only food source. A century ago, rising levels of toxic pollution poisoned the oceans and famine swept the planet. The rich hoarded food for their own use, and the poor were left to starve and die. But the poor rose up against this tyranny, and civil war engulfed the planet. Millions died in the fighting, and huge sections of Taris were destroyed or abandoned. The rebellion was crushed in the end. Thousands were taken prisoner. The jails could not hold them all, and so the practice of banishing all prisoners to the Undercity was born.
To put this in an American context, the planet-wide sprawling city world of Taris is on average less densely populated than the top 39 most densely populated states in America, just above Utah. In short, it cannot be this lightly populated. The number presented is at odds with the worlds of Taris and Coruscant as they are presented in lore and visually. A far more realistic estimate of the population density would be equivalent to the most densely populated cities on Earth. That is just considering what things would be like on the surface, without factoring underground settlements or sprawling multi-kilometer towers people live in. The Philippines has the 3 most densely populated cities on Earth, according to Wikipedia. They range from 43,000 to 38,000 to 31,000 people per square kilometer. Porting these numbers over to Coruscant, which has a smaller surface area than Earth at 470 million kilometers squared, gives us a planetary surface dwelling population that ranges from 20.2 trillion to as low as 14.7 trillion people. This is without truly exploring the degrees to which you can cram people inside buildings that cover the entire planet and go anything from 2 to 4 kilometers tall or higher. Coruscant will get a video on its own at a later date, but understand that Coruscant stood layer upon layer over 86,000 years before the modern day, and they never stopped building. For Taris, before it was bombed into dust, this number may be somewhat lower, as the planet is 30% made up of water. Yet still, with modern high-density figures, we have an upper limit surface-dwelling population of 15 trillion, and a lower limit of 11 trillion. These, in my mind, are going to be wildly understating the true population size. I remind you that there are multiple levels on Taris, with each constituting its own city. For a real-world example, the Les Lignon residential block in Switzerland was designed in the 70s, and housed some 6,500 residents. It's less than a square kilometer of space, and at most rises about 300 meters into the air. Tarisian or Coruscanti attempt at packaging humans like sardines could easily see numbers approaching the hundreds of thousands for individual buildings that are several times taller on average than the largest attempts we ourselves have ever made. This has implications for the long-term galactic population when Coruscant has frequently been hemorrhaging expats for thousands of years. While Coruscant itself is not within the borders of the Sith Empire, its diaspora has formed the basis of colonial populations across the galaxy. Those worlds themselves began settling additional worlds, like in the case of the Tianese and Kuwaiti, millennia before the hyperdrive was invented, without factoring in the countless other alien races. On the note of galactic population and colonization, per the Essential Atlas,
in the early years of galactic civilization, the fear was that the Republic was too small to hold together. Travel and communications were so slow that many core worlds quickly lost control of their colonies, which formed their own region beyond the core. But within a millennium, the opposite problem dominated debate on Coruscant. Was the Republic too big to stay together? The Republic's rapid early expansion was in some ways an accident. The newly blazed Polemian trade route connected the galaxy's central systems with the Tion cluster, whose armadas soon stormed down the great hyperspace route. The Polemians' colonies and peaceful alien civilizations sought the Republic's protection from the depredations of the Tionese and the fearsome Hutts. By granting such protection and bringing the Tion to heel, the Republic became a galaxy-spanning civilization before it truly decided that was what it ought to be.
Even in the KOTOR era, we have remote worlds far from Coruscant potentially boasting trillions of citizens just on the edge of Revan and Malak's empire. It should be emphasized that Taris is for all intents and purposes a forgettable, irrelevant backwater that has faded in significance in the galactic eye, and Malak was able to conquer the planet in just a few days.
We've been slipping in and out of consciousness for a couple of days now, so I imagine you're pretty confused about things, but try not to worry. We're safe. At least for the moment. We're in an abandoned apartment on the planet of Taris. We were banged up pretty bad when our escape pod crashed, but luckily I wasn't seriously hurt. I was able to drag you away from our crash site and all the confusion, and I stumbled into this abandoned apartment. By the time the Sith arrived on the scene, we were long gone. Taris is under Sith control. Their fleet is orbiting the planet, they've declared martial law, and they've imposed a planet-wide quarantine. But I've been in worse spots.
You looking to buy some supplies? My shop's the largest one in all of Upper Terrace. Best selection on the planet. Whatever you need, I've got. Well, mostly.
Mostly? What do you mean by that?
The Sith confiscated all my heavy weapons, and they impounded all my ships and swoop bikes. But I've still got a real nice selection, if you're interested. It's not smart to say bad things about the people in power, if you get my meaning. I just wish the Sith would ease up on the quarantine, though. They're killing my business. I can't say I like having them here in Upper City, but it could be worse, and we're still a lot better off than the Lower City, what with those swoop gangs and all.
Greetings and good day. On behalf of the new Sith rulers, I am programmed to encourage you to enjoy your stay on Taris.
Chingpala niska mule tun ratatigin podranko. Disarcha doma wanakonda tama. Mule tonki ba non tontek. Tunni chachon kun ne mule brabast.
We know from the Old Republic MMO that the civilization out in the unknown regions from Iokath had a number of planets that each had more than 2 trillion inhabitants on average living there, around 700 years before KOTOR began.
This place used to be the superweapons control room. Looks like our crispy friend here was the last one to use it. Over a millennia ago.
Search the records for any signs of what wiped them out.
Looks like Iokath's creators were fighting a civil war. One side built the weapon, but something went wrong. The superweapon's more dangerous than we thought. It wiped out all life on this planet. According to this data, it was tested on 4 different planets before Iokath. All successful. Over 10 trillion lives gone. This isn't a weapon. It's the apocalypse.
We have a few other population centers that we know of that existed at this time, and they're all forgettable backwaters. Taris, being the premier, is a forgotten world on the edge of the Republic. Goroth Prime existed some 40 years before the events of KOTOR 1, along the frontier of space, and yet with a civilization only 10,000 years old, came to more than 5 billion people. We have an example from Kni, a refugee from a nameless Duros colony that hosted billions of its kind.
Mundi hadong na chikong kabi, uba batu kochi, tong nong bong shang yung yang, tong hatok smaktelia, yatuka ulwan kinkun na ba murira, rachikun, mucha shakpanpa.
It's important to forever emphasize that in the history of galactic colonization, there have been millions of worlds that were not only colonized, but populated enough to require representation in the Galactic Senate 13,000 years before this era. To put this in an Earth perspective, 12,000 years ago for us, had estimates of a global population of humans in the single-digit million category worldwide. We did not, then or now, possess advanced exotic fuel sources or faster-than-light travel, the ability to clone entire races, or mass-produce droid slaves to do our bidding without need for rest or sleep. We may never have the advanced miracle cure-alls like Bacta, Kolto, or the ability to make replacement organs. 12,000 years before KOTOR, all these things existed, and existed for thousands of years before that. The true population figure of Malak's empire, with over 1/3 of the settled galaxy in its territory, is going to be a mammoth in terms of population. If we assumed even 1/3 of our minimalist figure of 4.5 million worlds had similar population averages to the slave worlds under the Rakata more than 20,000 years ago, we'd still be looking at around 3 quadrillion sentients. This number is far lower than what I feel is reasonable, based on the facts we have. Even the larger figure I have given, I feel, is short-changing the Sith, considering the actual number of worlds will be at least an order of magnitudes greater than that, to call back to the statement that the Republic had over 100 million systems in its territory over 10,000 years ago. Plus, West End Games states that planets more than 2 epochs of technological development behind hyperdrive societies would have 4 to 5 billion people on average. We're going to be using what I consider to be a lower number than what is possible, so with 18 to 22.5 quadrillion people across millions of worlds, and a military manpower potential of 1.3 to 1.6 quadrillion soldiers, able to be conscripted into the armed forces at the very least, I'm going to assume that at least half of that number will be humans, because their dominance in both galactic history and in representation of the Sith Empire from what KOTOR shows us, ignoring the limitations of the medium. It should be highlighted that dominating population-wise does not necessarily mean that there are no aliens, or that they are an insignificant fraction. We know that there are species comparably as widespread as humans, such as the Duros and Twi'leks, and entire regions of space where one may never see a human at all. Understand that Mandalorian space is a small part of the Empire it would eventually encompass, but humans are, while a significant portion, not the only individuals who join.
There was a better way, and Mandalore the Ultimate was determined to find it. The defeated Crusaders returned to Mandalorian space to learn that their leader had received a new vision on Shogun. From now on, non-Tongs who proved themselves in battle and upheld the Mandalorian warrior code were full members of the clans. Now they would hold the territory they conquered, creating an industrial society based on warrior codes. Warriors would rule, supported by farmers, artisans, and manufacturers who accepted their place in the Mandalorian hierarchy, with slaves and those without honor below them. Mandalore the Ultimate's decision swelled the clan's ranks with humans, Mandalians, Jaquelians, and other Mandalorian vassals.
Mandalore the Ultimate would then go on to further augment his forces with various aliens you probably didn't know numbered among the Crusaders, by the billions.
Now, the clan leader sent his Neo-Crusaders outward, conquering a swath of worlds between the Republic's borders, pockets of Republic colonial space, and the Tian. The Neo-Crusaders found rich worlds for Mandalore's growing empire, and billions of recruits: Hirakians, Ilamen, Tishshar, Fopians, Togruta, Drakmarians, Thalassians, Nalroni, and Zygarians.
So Mandalore the Ultimate was able to pull further recruits from 9 lesser-known races at the time. This is decidedly before waging total war and mass conscription on the Republic itself. Keep in mind that the new Mandalorian ethos of the time means that warriors, these billions of new recruits, are just one piece of the Mandalorian society. Even if a full 10% of conquered peoples were conscripted, these worlds would have to supply tens or even hundreds of billions of Siths who aren't even human. And this territory is now an element of the Sith Empire. I cannot adequately quantify the percentage share of aliens in Malak's empire. There's going to be a lot of them. Arguably, millions of distinct species will have population representation in the Sith Empire, by virtue of millennia of migration, having their homeworlds fall within its borders, or being attracted to the juggernaut of the era, and its societal value of rewarding the strong. So, let's close the video out and bring up our comparisons for both. The Covenant, with an upper end assumption of their population, could expect to have roughly 25 to 50 trillion citizens at an extreme stretch, with some single digits value of trillions of soldiers, if the Hive Queens were to be sufficiently motivated to supply a ministry tithe of as many. And considering what is implicit in the name and literal role of the Covenant drone, I would not be surprised if we could see multiple trillions of soldiers supplied, so long as they can be motivated enough to care. Grunts are, if you ignore the evidence to the contrary, around the same or greater in number. Elites follow closely behind in sheer numbers, in the hundreds of billions, followed by grunts and then jackals, each forwarding over 10 billion disposable infantrymen each. Then hunters come around with 5 to 15 billion heavy infantry, with brutes coming in with potentially a billion shock troops or more. It's an impressive mustering of overwhelming force the UNSC could not defeat in a straight up fight, even if they had 1,000,000 times as many Spartans as they had in their possession during the war. So many men divided equally among the 800 UNSC colonies would mean the Covenant could dedicate billions of soldiers to conquering each world simultaneously if it were accurate. That being said, In the context of Star Wars and of more accurate population figures, the Covenant would realistically, even when taking their entire population into account, be lost among the countless worlds and populations of the Star Wars galaxy at large. Individual planets like Taris or Coruscant and other ecumenopoli across the galaxy could easily house and absorb their citizens if you stop and truly consider the implications of what is established about these worlds. Billions of residential buildings stretching kilometers in the sky, with layered cities encompassing them all the way to the planet's surface, and in some cases, thousands of levels even below that. The galaxy will have origin worlds for millions of just the known species in existence, most of which will be the sole or main sentient species on their respective planet. Even if one were to consider the outliers as the rule, and grant each world 4 sentient races sharing the same world, we would still have more than as many as 5 million worlds at the founding of the Republic, before even considering the oncoming eons of colonization and growth. The Sith Empire, for its part, could expect population numbers well beyond the quadrillion mark. Keep in mind, in its heyday, it was fighting against a more populated, more industrial developed and territorially larger foe, and it was winning. Coruscant alone could expect to have anything from hundreds of trillions to quadrillions of citizens within its atmosphere, and by extension, field trillions of conscripts to fight the Sith in its various wars across history. Even in this diminished scenario, Malak's empire could boast over 11 quadrillion humans and as many aliens across thousands or millions of distinct and diverse populations. The human share of the military could feasibly number 850 trillion troops, with an equal number of soldiers coming from all manner of exotic and unique species. Sith soldiers on the front lines would be orders of magnitudes more numerous and expendable than the grunts and drones combined. We could say that all the Covenant worlds that could possibly exist were as populated as High Charity. Give each man, woman and prophet a plasma rifle, throw them at the Sith, and the Sith would still outnumber them by more than 5 to 1. This is without so much as toe dipping into the many countless legions of war droids that the Sith have to supplement their forces, which can be made and fielded in a fraction of the time. With the numbers that we are using, the Covenant could murder Sith troopers at rates of 1,000 to 1 for every man they lose, and the Sith would still come out swinging. The Sith blow this one out of the park. These numbers may be impressive for both factions, but they mean nothing if they can't get their fighting men to where they need to be. Let's talk about warships, and how many warships either side can expect to field next time.
Let's pray. Why don't you go back to where you came from, eh? Fuck, I'm talking to you. I'm talking to you. Why don't you fuck off? So fuck off back to where you came from.
Right, you alien scum. Everybody get up against the wall. This is a raid.